A child's doll collection had always been a source of fascination for her. It started innocently enough, with just a few toys she'd received over the years from her grandmother and friends, but over time, it grew. The dolls were kept meticulously on a shelf in her room, each one carefully arranged, their glass eyes staring out as though they were waiting for something. Some of them were new, purchased from local stores, while others were old, some even antique, passed down from one generation to the next. Each had its own story, its own memory, but all were carefully positioned so they never seemed to look out of place. That was until the shifting began. At first, it was subtle, a slight change in their alignment, as if they had moved just a little bit. It could have been explained away. Maybe the child had played with them without remembering, or perhaps her parents had moved them for dusting. But the changes became more pronounced over the weeks. The dolls started to appear in different positions each morning, as though someone had been moving them in the dead of night. The child would wake to find a doll that was once standing now sitting, or one that had been placed neatly at the end of the shelf, now sitting in the middle. There were no signs of tampering, no evidence that anything had physically touched the dolls. Her parents at first dismissed it as the product of an overactive imagination. "It's just a phase," her mother said with a reassuring smile as she cleaned the room. "You're just being silly," her father added, shrugging it off. They didn't think much of it. After all, it was only dolls, right? Nothing to worry about. But then things began to get stranger. One evening, as her parents were settling into their own room, they heard their daughter Sarah calling them. Her voice was thin, distant, almost as if it wasn't entirely her own. They rushed to her room only to find her standing by the shelf, her wide eyes scanning the dolls. "There's something wrong with them," she said, her tone flat, as if she had seen something they could not. Her gaze was locked on the dolls, and for the first time, her parents noticed something peculiar. A thin layer of dust had settled on the floor around the shelf, and in the dust they saw small, delicate footprints, footprints that were too small to belong to any living person. "Sarah," her father asked gently, trying to mask the unease in his voice, "what are these?" Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, the strange tracks leading to a doll at the far end of the shelf. It was one of her favorites, an old porcelain figure with cracked features, a doll that her grandmother had given her. The doll's head had been turned, facing Sarah. "I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice trembling. The parents brushed it off again, telling themselves that perhaps it was just a strange coincidence. But as days passed, the footprints in the dust became more frequent, and each time the dolls seemed to be in a different arrangement, more disordered than before. One morning, a doll that had been on the far left of the shelf was now sitting on the windowsill. Another was tilted precariously to one side. A few days later, Sarah's favorite porcelain doll was missing. At first, they assumed Sarah had moved it, but she denied it with growing distress. "I didn't touch it," she insisted. "I didn't move anything." Her father scolded her lightly, thinking she was just playing tricks. But something about the situation seemed off. That night, the parents locked the door to her room, hoping to stop whatever it was that was causing the disturbances. They placed a small chair under the doorknob, as though to prevent anyone from entering or exiting without them knowing. But when they checked the next morning, the chair had been moved. The door had been opened, and the room was exactly as it had been the night before, except for one thing: the missing doll. It was back on the shelf, sitting perfectly upright as though nothing had ever happened. As time passed, the disturbances grew more unnerving. The dolls began to make noises, soft, clicking sounds in the middle of the night that could be mistaken for wind or the settling of the house. But every night, the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. At times, it sounded like the clicking of porcelain against wood, like the dolls were moving, whispering to each other. Sarah started having nightmares. She would wake in a cold sweat, her face pale, and sometimes when she opened her eyes, she could swear that the dolls had moved even closer to her bed. Her mother, concerned, tried to soothe her by moving the dolls out of the room, but as soon as they were gone, Sarah would become inconsolable. She would beg for the dolls to come back, saying that they were waiting for her. Her father scoffed, thinking it was just a phase, but something gnawed at him. The air in the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. One night, Sarah's parents decided to sit in her room and keep watch, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. They sat in the corner, just out of her sight, watching the shelf carefully. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of the wooden floors. Midnight passed, and still there was nothing. But just as they were about to give up, Sarah's father noticed something strange. He saw the edge of a shadow flicker along the wall near the dolls. His breath caught in his throat. The shadow moved again, and then, with sudden clarity, he saw it. One of the dolls had shifted. It had been at the far left of the shelf, but now it was closer to the center, its face turned in his direction. His eyes widened, and he grabbed his wife's arm, pulling her attention to the shelf. They watched in stunned silence as another doll slowly, almost imperceptibly, tilted its head. It was as if the dolls were aware of their presence, acknowledging their existence. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. The porcelain doll Sarah had lost weeks earlier fell to the floor, its delicate form shattered into pieces. The sound sent a chill down their spines. The room grew colder, and the air became thick as though something unseen was watching them. The faint smell of old dust and decay filled their nostrils, and Sarah's soft voice floated in the stillness. "They want me," she whispered. Her parents rushed to her side, their faces pale, but when they turned back to the shelf, they saw something far worse than they could have imagined. The dolls were gone. The shelf was empty. Not a single doll remained, just the dust and the footprints. And somewhere, deep within the house, they could hear faint, unmistakable footsteps echoing on the wood floors. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and worry. Sarah's parents couldn't explain what had happened, nor could they ignore the growing sense of unease that lingered in the house. They tried to focus on their daily lives, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Each time they walked past her room, they would glance in, half expecting the dolls to be back, staring out from the shelf with their empty eyes. But the shelf remained bare, eerily so. Sarah herself seemed more withdrawn than usual. She barely spoke, and when she did, it was only in hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly might anger whatever presence had taken over their home. Her once bright eyes were now clouded with fear, and her cheeks were pale, as though she hadn't slept in days. Her parents tried everything they could think of to comfort her, but nothing worked. Her nightmares worsened, and she would wake up trembling, clutching her blankets as though something invisible had been trying to pull her away. One evening, Sarah's mother, Kate, sat down with her to ask her what was going on. She needed to understand what had happened, what had caused the change in Sarah's behavior. "Honey, I need you to talk to me," Kate said gently, brushing Sarah's hair back from her forehead. "Tell me what's going on. Why are you so afraid?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "It's the dolls," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're still here. They're watching me." Kate's heart sank. She wanted to reassure Sarah, to tell her that there was nothing to fear, but she couldn't. Deep down, she felt that whatever was happening was beyond her understanding, something that was far too dark to ignore. She had heard strange noises at night, too, soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls, the faint sound of something scraping against the floorboard. But when she went to check, there was nothing there. The next morning, Kate decided to check the room again, hoping that Sarah had simply been imagining things. She stood in the doorway, taking in the familiar sight of the room: the small bed, the bookshelf stacked with books, the window where the light filtered in gently. But something was different. As she stepped inside, her eyes were drawn to the corner of the room where Sarah's old toy chest sat. She couldn't explain it, but it seemed to be shifting. The chest that had been in the corner for years now appeared to be slightly askew, its lid half open. Kate froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had never seen it like this before. It was as though someone had opened the chest during the night, perhaps even rifled through its contents. She walked over to it slowly, her hands trembling. When she opened the lid, she gasped. Inside the chest, there were no toys, no stuffed animals or trinkets. Instead, there was an assortment of the dolls that had been on the shelf in Sarah's room. They were packed in haphazardly, their glass eyes staring out at her, their heads tilted in unnatural positions. It was as if they had been shoved into the chest in a hurry, as if they were trying to hide. Kate stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She slammed the chest shut, her mind racing. How had these dolls ended up in here? She was certain that they had been on the shelf just hours before. Had Sarah moved them? But no, Sarah hadn't even been near the chest, and yet here they were, every last one of them, sitting in the chest as though they had never been anywhere else. She rushed to find her husband, Paul. She needed him to see this. But when she told him, he dismissed it with a weary laugh, brushing it off as just another figment of their daughter's imagination. "You're overreacting," he said. "It's just a few dolls. Sarah must have moved them herself. You know how kids are, always playing with things and then forgetting about it." Kate didn't know what to say. She had tried to explain her feelings, but Paul seemed unwilling to accept that something might be seriously wrong. She couldn't understand how he could be so calm about all of this. The dolls had been in the chest, right? But there was something about them, something about the way they had been placed, that made her blood run cold. They had been arranged with an almost deliberate care, as if someone had gone out of their way to pack them in just the right way. The following night, as Kate lay awake in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was unusually quiet, too quiet in fact. She had grown used to the creaks of the floorboards and the occasional sound of pipes settling in the walls, but tonight everything was still. It was an unnatural stillness, one that set her on edge. She listened carefully, straining to hear anything that might explain the unease she felt. That was when she heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from the direction of Sarah's room. Kate's heart leapt into her throat. She got out of bed and moved as quietly as she could down the hall. The scraping sound grew louder as she approached the door to Sarah's room until it was almost deafening. She stood in the doorway, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint moonlight that filtered through the window. At first, she saw nothing, but as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed something moving near the shelf. It was one of the dolls. Its small porcelain feet were scraping against the wood, dragging itself across the floor, moving as though it had a life of its own. Kate froze in horror. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her breath caught in her throat, and her legs felt like they might give out from under her. But before she could react, the doll stopped moving. It turned its head slowly, its glass eyes meeting hers in the darkness. For a brief moment, it seemed to study her, its gaze unwavering, before it slowly lowered its head and returned to its previous position on the shelf. Kate couldn't move. She wanted to scream, to wake her husband, but no sound would come. She stood frozen, her mind racing, unable to process what had just happened. The doll had moved on its own. She had seen it with her own eyes. She backed out of the room slowly, her body shaking with fear. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't understand it. But one thing was certain: the dolls were alive, or at least something about them was, and whatever it wasn't friendly. Kate didn't sleep that night. She stayed awake, lying in bed with her eyes wide open, listening for any sound, any movement. The house was still, but she could feel the presence of something lurking in the darkness. She knew the dolls were out there somewhere, watching. The next morning, Sarah's parents decided they could no longer ignore the strangeness of the situation. They called a local priest, hoping he might have some insight into what was happening in their home. The priest, an older man named Father Benedict, arrived later that afternoon, his face grave as he stepped inside. "I've seen this before," he said quietly, as they led him into Sarah's room. "I've dealt with things like this. I can't say exactly what's happening here, but I can tell you this: it's not normal." He glanced at the empty shelf where the dolls had once been. "These things, they can take on a life of their own. They can become vessels for something else, something dark." Kate felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had hoped that maybe Father Benedict would have an explanation that made sense, but this wasn't what she had expected to hear. "How do we stop it?" Paul asked, his voice tight with worry. Father Benedict hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. It's not something that can be easily fixed. You need to get rid of them, burn them, destroy them. Only then will the presence leave." But even as he spoke, the hairs on the back of Kate's neck stood up. She could feel it. Something was watching them. Something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for them to make their move. and she knew that whatever it was, it wouldn't let them go without a fight. Father Benedict left the house just after dusk, his words lingering in the air like an ominous fog. "You must destroy the dolls," he had said. "They must be burned. Only then will it end." But Kate and Paul, despite their fear, couldn't bring themselves to follow his advice immediately. There was something that held them back, something that whispered in the dark corners of their minds, telling them that once they took the dolls away, once they destroyed them, they might never escape what was coming next. The night passed in silence. The house, though unnaturally still, seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls were watching and waiting for the next move. Sarah had fallen asleep in her bed, her small body curled up tightly under the blankets, her face pale as if she hadn't rested in days. Kate stood by her door, watching the child sleep, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the confusion and fear that had gripped her since the dolls had first begun to move. Her heart raced with a terrifying certainty. The dolls weren't just toys. They were something else. They were a doorway, a vessel for something malevolent, something that didn't belong in their world. Kate couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the dolls that were alive. It was the house itself, infected by whatever darkness had crept in with them. It was like an unseen hand had reached into their home and turned everything upside down. The air itself felt thick, heavy, as though it was pressing in from all sides, and yet she couldn't bring herself to destroy them. What if they were a warning, a sign that something much worse was coming, something they couldn't even comprehend? As the hours dragged on, Kate found herself walking down the hallway toward the room where the dolls had once been. She couldn't explain why she was drawn there, but it felt as though the house was pulling her in like a magnet. She knew she should just go to bed and try to forget about everything, but instead she found herself standing in front of the now empty shelf. Her breath caught in her throat when she noticed something new. A small, delicate handprint had appeared on the dust-covered wood. It wasn't a child's handprint. No, it was far too small, almost as if a tiny, fragile hand had been placed there for no reason at all. Kate reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the imprint. The air around her felt colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was wrong. Something had been watching her, waiting. She turned quickly, nearly stumbling, as she moved away from the shelf. As she did, her eyes caught sight of the toy chest again. It was in the corner of the room, exactly where it had always been, but it looked different. The lid was slightly ajar, and it appeared as though something had been moving inside it. She hadn't opened the chest since that day when the dolls had mysteriously appeared there. She wasn't sure why, but she felt compelled to check it once more. The moment she opened the lid, her breath caught in her throat. The dolls were inside, but they weren't just sitting there. They were arranged in a perfect circle, their eyes all turned inward, staring at something in the center of the chest. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Kate stepped back, her mind racing. This was impossible. She had seen the dolls disappear from the shelf. She had watched them be moved into the chest, only to find them back on the shelf the next morning. How could they be back in the chest again? The door creaked behind her, and Kate spun around, her heart racing in her chest. She half expected to see Sarah standing there, But it wasn't her. It was Paul. His face was pale, his expression tight with worry. "Kate," he whispered urgently, his voice hoarse, "I've been looking everywhere for you. You need to come to the living room." "What is it?" Kate asked, her voice barely a whisper, her pulse quickening. Paul didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked over her shoulder, his eyes drawn to the toy chest. Kate turned and saw that it was empty. The dolls were gone. "I felt something," Paul said finally, his eyes distant. "Something is in the house. I don't know what it is, but it's here with us, and it's waiting for us to make a mistake." Kate's mind raced. She had felt it too, that presence that seemed to creep into every corner of their home, that strange, suffocating feeling that told her they were no longer alone. The house was alive with something dark, something that had been awakened by the dolls, and it wasn't going to leave until it had what it wanted. Paul grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the chest. "We need to leave," he said, his voice desperate. "We can't stay here anymore. We have to get out before it's too late." But as they moved toward the door, they heard a faint sound. It was soft at first, like the whisper of wind through the trees. Then it grew louder, until it was unmistakable. A voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You can't leave," the voice hissed. "Not until it's done." The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the air grew cold again. Kate looked around, but there was nothing. No one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, a disembodied, malevolent presence that surrounded them, closing in like a trap. "Don't listen to it," Paul said, his voice shaking. "We need to go now." But as they turned to leave, something caught Kate's eye. There, at the far end of the hallway, the dolls were standing in a line, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. They were all facing her, their porcelain faces twisted into expressions of something that could only be described as pure, unbridled malice. And in the center of the line stood Sarah's favorite doll, the porcelain one that had been lost so long ago, its cracked face now wearing a sinister, knowing smile. It was then that Kate understood. The dolls had never been the problem. They were just the beginning. The real horror had been something much darker, something that had attached itself to the dolls, feeding on their innocence and using them to open a doorway, a path for the darkness to pour into their world. "We have to burn them," Kate whispered urgently, her hand shaking as she reached for Paul's arm. But before they could make a move, the dolls began to move, slowly, deliberately, their small feet scraping across the floor. They advanced toward them, their eyes never leaving their faces. Kate and Paul backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, and no matter how far they walked, the dolls kept coming. They had no choice. They had to destroy them, and they had to do it now. With shaking hands, Kate grabbed the nearest doll, the porcelain figure that had once been her daughter's pride and joy. She held it tightly, feeling the coldness of the porcelain against her skin, and moved toward the fireplace. As she approached the flames, she hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The doll's glass eyes seemed to plead with her, as if it knew what was about to happen. But Kate knew what she had to do. She tossed the doll into the fire, watching as the flames consumed it, crackling and popping as it burned. And then something changed. The other dolls stopped moving. The air cleared. The pressure that had been bearing down on them lifted, and for the first time in days, the house felt still. The whispers stopped. The dolls, now reduced to nothing more than ash, lay in the smoldering embers of the fire, their eyes dull and lifeless. Kate and Paul stood in the center of the room, their breathing heavy and ragged, but there was no fear now. The house was silent. And yet, as they stood there, something else flickered in the darkness, a shadow, barely visible against the walls. For a moment, they stood frozen, unsure whether it was just their imagination, a trick of the light. But then they heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "It's not over." And that was when they realized the truth. The dolls had never been the true source of the evil. The house itself was alive, and it had been waiting for them all along.